Hi, I'm Dr. Avanti Kumar Singh. In over 20 years of practicing both Western medicine and Eastern healing traditions, the most important thing that I've learned is that healing is a journey we take together. So on this podcast, I'll be demystifying Ayurveda and other integrated medicine, showing how these simple, ancient practices are the keys to unlocking a healthy modern life. We are all healing catalysts because healing starts within. It starts with you, and it starts right now. This is a Soulfire production. Episode number 127. Hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome back to the Healing Catalyst podcast. I am so happy to be back with you again this week. And I am so happy that I get to share with you that I had a really exciting week last week. You know, my website is being updated. And so I got to see the new brand design and I can't wait to share it with all of you. It is so beautiful. That's coming next month. I also had a photo shoot for new headshots for my second book, which comes out on December 17th. It's called The Longevity Formula, and it's available for pre-order now. I hope that you guys will all go check it out. I've shared the links in the show notes for you, and you can see the new cover. It's really, really exciting to see this coming together. I would be so grateful if all of you would pre-order the book because it really, really helps an author so much in getting their work out into the world. So I've included that link in the show notes for you. And speaking of books and being an author and sharing work out in the world, today I have a really special episode for you, one that's really close to my heart. I am so excited to have Mr. John Schu, Mr. Schu, as he's known by his students, with us today. You know, John is not just a beloved educator and now a New York Times bestselling author, but also a dear friend who has touched many, many lives, including those of my own children. John was actually my daughter Isha's school librarian when she was in elementary school, and he was my son Zane's third grade teacher. And to this day, Zane will tell you that Mr. Schu is the most important teacher he has ever had. And still to this day is his favorite teacher 17 years later. And honestly, I think that probably most every kid who has been in any of John's engaging school and library visits all over the country and all over the world for the last decade will tell you that Mr. Schu has fueled their love of reading. A little bit about John. John Schu has made a career out of advocating for the people and the things he cares about most: kids, books, and the things that connect them. He was named a Library Journal mover and shaker for his dynamic interactions with students and his passionate adoption of new technologies as a means of connecting authors, illustrators, books, and readers. He is the children's librarian for Bookalicious, a part-time lecturer at Rutgers University, and shares his love of reading with countless educators and students around the world. He's also the author of 4 books, including This is a Story, This is a School, The Gift of Story, and his recent book that was released just a few weeks ago, Louder Than Hunger. His powerful novel, which is also a memoir, which was an instant New York Times bestseller within a few days of being published. I'm so excited for him. In our conversation, John shares his early influences, his path from reader to writer, and the therapeutic role of personal narrative and sharing our stories. You'll hear John open up about the process of writing Louder Than Hunger and how it helped him confront and share his own story of struggling with anorexia nervosa as a teenager. We also discuss the vital role of books in providing comfort and belonging and serving as a mirror for young readers to see themselves authentically reflected in the characters that they read about. John also talks about the significance of narrative medicine and how poetry, how verse creates space for healing to help regulate the nervous system, especially when we're tackling intense emotions and topics. Addressing the stigma around eating disorders in boys and men, John also emphasizes the importance of early intervention and support and shares his hope that his book, Louder Than Hunger, will show readers that there is a path to the other side of their struggles. I reflected on this conversation a lot after recording the interview and before recording this intro. And what I was struck by was that I learned from this conversation that John's journey is not just about writing a novel, about writing a New York Times bestseller. It's about turning his deepest struggles into a story that is filled with honesty and hope, a story that provides a backdrop for understanding the healing power of stories and the importance of finding your voice. As someone who's seen John's transformative impact on young minds, including my own children, on Zane and Isha, I am so moved by his ability to see and nurture the stories that are in each of us. I am so honored to share with you my conversation with Mr. Schu about breaking the stigmas around eating disorders in boys and how reading and writing our personal stories can support our healing. Hello, John. I am so excited to be here on the podcast with you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very, very busy book tour schedule right now to do this with me.
Well, and I'm so excited to be here with you. I think we've known each other for almost 20 years.
I know. I think. I was just going to say that because you were Zane's third grade teacher.
Yes.
And to this day, he's now 25 years old and he still says that you're his absolute all-time favorite teacher through all of his schooling, college, graduate school, everything. Mr. Schu is his absolute favorite because you had a really big impact on him and his life. So
I always tell students during school visits that teachers aren't supposed to have a favorite student, but he is my favorite student.
Oh my gosh. He is going to love hearing that. Oh my God. You will have made his day by saying that. And then Isha also had you as not a teacher, but as the librarian at grade school. So we've known each other for a very, very long time. And I think, one of the things that you really helped Zane and even Isha to a certain extent, but really Zane, I mean, he was already a reader. He loved to read, but you really really cemented that for him because you really had such a passion for reading yourself. And I think your enthusiasm as being an influential adult in his life and seeing how much you love to read. And he would say, Mommy, Mr. Schu read another book. Do you know he's read like 15 books this week? And I was like, yep, I know. So,
Well, I think it's the best way to bond with a group of people.
For sure.
Reading aloud bonds us together. Reading aloud connects us together. And I often say to people that we're not reading the book together. We're experiencing the book together. And so many of the books and characters that we experienced together when I was your children's teacher became a part of our classroom, became a part of our library.
Right.
And now that I get to travel all over the world doing that, it fills my heart with so much joy and so many wonderful moments of connection.
Yeah, it's incredible what you have done with your career from being at a small, elementary school out in the west suburbs of Chicago to then, going on to be a librarian and then sort of on this very national and even international stage with some of the things that you've done. It's just been incredible to watch your career. So I'm so excited for you. But, I wanted to start with, sort of a general question with you is, when did your love of reading start? I know that you talk about this a little bit in the character in your book, but how did you really start to love reading? What was that sort of spark that happened for you?
Yeah. So it really comes from my grandma. My grandma was my best friend. My grandma was everything to me as a child. And in my book, Louder Than Hunger, Jake's grandma, and I am really Jake. Jake's name is Jake Edward Stacy, and my name is John Edward Schumacher. That's my legal name. We have the same initials, and so much that happens to Jake in the book really happened to me. And my grandma, like Jake, was my best friend. She was the person who helped me fall in love with stories. And a lot of it is because of a grocery store called Jewel Osco, which people in Illinois are most likely familiar with.
Yep.
And specifically, it was the Jewel Osco in Tinley Park, Illinois, where my grandma and I would go every Saturday to buy groceries, but she would always buy me a book because in the 1980s, it was very common for there to be big book displays by the checkout, mostly Walt Disney books. And in 1986, my grandma bought me a book called Goofy's Big Race. And I was a very anxious child. I was a child that liked to rush through things all of the time. And there's a refrain in that book, which is slow and steady, steady and slow. That's the way we always go. And my grandma would always repeat that to me. And at that time in 1986, I don't think I could fully read by myself independently, but my grandma had read that book to me so many times that I could read the book because I could recite the book. So I really think I became a reader. I fell in love with books because of Goofy's Big Race. And just 2 days ago, I entered a kindergarten classroom where they were waiting for me to do a pop-up visit. And the kindergarten teacher was reading her students Goofy's Big Race.
Oh my gosh.
And I started to cry.
Oh, it's such a full circle moment, right? Beautiful.
Yes.
So how did you move from reading to writing? Because again, as I mentioned, your whole thing was about reading. That's what you instilled such a love of in my kids and all of the kids that you taught. And even all these kids that you've been going and talking to at all these schools across the country for so many years now. How did you make that jump from reading to writing? Because I'll tell you, I mean, this is your fourth book, Louder Than Hunger? Fourth, fifth?
Let's see. This is a school. This is a story. The Gift of Story. I'm part of an anthology called The Creativity Project.
Right.
And then Louder Than Hunger.
Okay.
So 5. So I'm counting on my hands.
Yeah. And so the fact that you have 5 books, how did you make that jump from reading to then writing?
Yeah, I resisted it for a very, very long time. But I don't remember the exact year. I want to say 2009, maybe. I met someone named Molly O'Neill, who was an editor at HarperCollins at the time. And I met her at an event at Anderson's Bookshop in Naperville, Illinois. Yep. And she saw the way I was reacting with students. Some middle school students, former students, came with me to an event at the bookshop where they got to interact with the author. And it was the author's first time ever talking about the book. And Molly loved the way I interacted with them. And she emailed me the next day and asked me if I'd ever considered writing. And I said, no, I didn't identify. I didn't see myself as a writer. And every so often she would check in, and then she left her role as an editor and became an agent. And then she would write me and say, are you thinking about writing again? I'd love to represent you. And that's like every writer's dream. It doesn't normally happen that way.
Totally.
And I kept saying no. And then in 2017, one of my favorite authors, Amy Krauss Rosenthal, who wrote many picture books like Duck Rabbit and Exclamation Mark, and also wrote books for adults like Textbook, and was a well-known author in Chicago who would do a lot of social experiments in Chicago, and let's meet at the Bean and we're going to do a parade. And she was very, very creative, and she kept her own illness from people for a very, very long time. And she had terminal cancer, and she made it public maybe a month before she passed away. And the day after she passed away, StoryCorps released a conversation between her then 19-year-old daughter, Paris Rosenthal, and herself, in which Amy Krauss Rosenthal said to her daughter, make the most of your time here. And when I heard that, I wrote Molly O'Neill and I said, you must listen to this interview. And because of what Amy Krauss Rosenthal said, I'm now ready to write, because I know I have a lot of stories inside of me. And you see that in me, and you've been telling me that. But I really needed to hear that from Amy, who was like a person who I really admired and who I know still had so many stories left in her heart. And in Chicago, across from the Lincoln Park Zoo, there's a memorial to Amy Krauss Rosenthal. It's a yellow umbrella that says more on it. And whenever I'm stuck, I go to that umbrella and I talk to it. And whenever a new book comes out, I always leave copies around it, because I know that's something Amy Krauss Rosenthal would do and would appreciate. And so, because of what Amy said, make the most of your time here, I started to take writing seriously. And my first book that I sold, which was my third book to come out, This Is a Story, is dedicated to Amy Krauss Rosenthal.
Wow.
I know that was a long answer, but all because of Amy.
It's great. I mean, I think that, we get inspired by people. And when enough people ask us to write a book, we end up sitting down and writing it if it's something that's in us and if that's the impact we want to have in the world. Because some very similar happened to me. Like I had not planned on writing books. And then the next thing I know, I'm writing a book and writing a second book and the whole thing. So I understand.
Yeah, you get on that journey.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I do think that there is something, it's more than just the impact that we want to have on others. It's also, I think for many people who write, it's things that they are wanting to learn or maybe process for themselves. And so, I know that Louder Than Hunger is a memoir in many ways with a fictional character that is you. How did you decide that you were going to write this story? Because it's very personal.
Yeah.
How did that happen for you?
Well, when I first signed with Molly O'Neill, my agent, she asked me to tell her about my life and what stories could I, excavate from my heart and tell the world. And I did disclose to her that when I was in 8th grade and in high school, that I'd been hospitalized for anorexia nervosa, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, and anxiety. But when I entered college, I decided I never wanted to talk about that again because it became such a part of my identity. Or I was known as the boy with anorexia, and I was known as the boy who had missed so much school, and I was known as the boy who went on the Oprah Winfrey show when I was in high school and told Oprah that I never wanted to get better. And those identities were so negative to me. And I when I got to college, I said, I'm never going to look back. I'm never going to talk about that. And so when I shared that with Molly, I knew I wasn't ready emotionally yet to tell that story. And Molly said, that's okay, but maybe one day. Let's write some other books first, write some other books, and then maybe we can come back to that. And so from our conversations, we knew, well, I know a lot about school, so it makes sense for me to write a book called This is a School. And then I know a lot about stories. So I wrote a book called This is a Story, which is about my love of libraries. And then I wrote a book called The Gift of Story, which is all about the affective side of reading. And in it, I create a framework called the affective elements of story. And I'm just going to share them very, very quickly because if I hadn't created those, I wouldn't have been able to write Louder Than Hunger. So I have story is healer, how stories can help our hearts heal. Story is inspiration. Story is clarifier. Story is clarifier was the hardest chapter for me to write. And I didn't think I could ever write it. And I wrote my editor and I said, I'm never going to finish this book. I think I have to pull out of the contract. And my editor said, no, you can do it. Just take a break, like walk away from it for a month and then come back to it. And I walked away from it for 2 months. And then I went back to it and I finally wrote a little bit about my eating disorder in that chapter. And it just opened me up and it freed me. And I was never stuck for the rest of the book. Like I wrote the rest of the book, which was more than 60% of the book in 2 months because I just needed to open that up. And so when I finished writing The Gift of Story, I was very tired because I had been working on it for a long time. And I wrote most of the book in New York City. 46th and Broadway, I always tell kids, where the Marriott Marquis is across from the Booth Theater, is really good for me because I tell myself, if you meet your writing goal for the day, you can go see a Broadway show. If you don't, you can't see a Broadway show. And so I'm very motivated by that. And so I was on my way home from New York City, coming back to Chicago where I live, and this voice wouldn't stop talking to me. And right away, he told me his name was Jake, and I knew it was my middle school voice, my high school voice. And I wrote 10 poems during that flight. And I recently looked back at the notebook I wrote those in, and almost word for word, those 10 poems are the way they appear in the final copy of Louder Than Hunger. And that was March 2021. I wrote and wrote and wrote, and I sold the book in September of 2021. And then I did 6 more drafts after that. So it still was a long process. But yeah, it was because The Gift of Story, I think, gave me the confidence to write a longer book. But it also taught me like the psychology of story. And I applied my own framework to writing my own story.
Yeah, that's amazing. So can we go back to that framework? Because I think it has so much relevance to sort of what I really wanted to get into, which is how reading and writing, how story is healing. Because, I do think that that is very true. And my perspective has always been talking about it. I mean, that's my
Mm.
clinical, mind. And that's
Yeah.
the way I interact with people is in one-to-one sessions or, on a Zoom call or in a class, right? I'm sharing stories verbally with them. I mean, you do that too, but the reading and
Yeah.
the writing. And so can we go back to your framework of, story as
Sure.
inspiration? You said there's three parts: story as inspiration, story as healer, and story as clarifier, correct?
Oh, and I didn't do the rest. I'm sorry.
Oh,
There's
that's
two
okay.
more after
Okay,
that.
yeah,
because story as clarifier is what helped me write the book. And then there's
sure.
story as compassion, and then story as connector. And
Okay.
those are the five. Yeah.
Amazing. And so let's go back to that. Like, how did you sort of think about that framework when you were thinking about your story and writing it and
Yeah.
sharing it? And because it's a healing process as well, right?
Yeah. So to go back for the two inspirations for the gift of story, the one was a great author who I think your child Isha met, named Kate DiCamillo,
Yes.
had come to our school twice,
Mm-hmm.
and she and I became our good friends now. And I was once really stuck on something, and this is what she said to me. She said, "You can, you do, you can do this. I know you can do this. You can, you do. You were born to do just what you are doing, sharing your heart through story." And when Kate DiCamillo said that to me, I was like, yeah, she's right. Every day I get out of bed and say to myself, how am I going to share my heart through story with the students I meet at schools, with Uber drivers, with bartenders, with bellhops, with everyone I meet in my life? It's about sharing my story, learning their story, which then leads to connection. But I really didn't understand what it meant to share your heart through story. And so I wrote an entire book to figure that out. In order to do that, I asked hundreds of people to finish the sentence starter, story is ... And I realized very quickly we all define story differently.
Yeah.
I use the word story as an abstract noun usually. And the way you define story might be different from the way that your husband defines story, or your,
Sure.
I don't know, your shopkeeper or whomever. And so then I sorted all of those into different categories. And that's how I came up with the five that I shared. And then the second thing that inspired me was the work of Dr. Sayantani Dasgupta. She teaches at Columbia University in the School of Narrative Medicine, and she's a children's author. And I heard her speak at a conference about narrative medicine, and I'd never heard of that before.
Yes.
And I found it so fascinating. And I really wanted to take her class at Columbia, but that wasn't possible. And so Dr. Sayantani sent me her syllabus and articles, and I would meet with her, and she would teach me about how her job was to teach physicians and residents how to listen critically. And I thought that was so fascinating. And she talked to me a lot about how an examining room is a place of story.
Yes.
And if the doctor's not listening to you, you're not going to feel safe to tell your story.
Right.
And when she was a pediatrician, she would write reading prescriptions for her patients. And they left every meeting with a book, hopefully in the language that they spoke at home. And I was just so inspired by that.
Yeah.
And I use her work a lot in the gift of story, to create that framework. So those are the two main inspirations. So just applying, all of that, applying narrative medicine to my own life and listening to myself and writing authentically and writing in a way that, was vulnerable and I now realize was brave, was all the things that I learned about narrative medicine and other research while I was working on this book. I don't know if I answered that, but those are the two main things.
Yeah, no, I mean, narrative medicine it's an amazing concept and sort of field of study. And I've actually talked about it on this podcast before, but I love that we're talking about it from your perspective of you not being in medicine. I've talked to other physicians who've talked about narrative medicine, but you coming at it from a very different perspective, but it has been so impactful on you. And so I'm going to ask you about how writing this book, has helped you heal. But I want to first go back into the book because for all the listeners, and I know that I said this in the introduction already, that your book became an instant New York Times bestseller, which I'm so proud of you for. So
I still
excited.
Can't believe.
Congratulations. It's amazing.
Thank you.
It's amazing. And it's for so many reasons that I think that has happened. But, can you tell us a little bit about the main character, Jake? You said that that's really you. And, how you decided what you were going to include and what you weren't going to include in the story?
Yeah. Yeah, so I knew right away I didn't want to write it as a memoir. In many ways, to have a little distance from myself, because it's not all true. A lot of the secondary characters I created in order to have a full story.
Sure.
And then, two, I wanted to protect some people in my own life. You know, a lot of people that I would have written about are still alive, and it's really not my story to tell their stories.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to have to run things by them. And so I decided, well, this is fiction with lots inspired by my own life.
Sure.
And there are many characters missing. So I tried to include anything that was really like only me, not my mom, not my dad. I do have a brother. Jake does not have a brother. And so I did a lot of exercises where I would go backwards in time, all the way back to like from 1996 back to 1986. And I would just write lots of things that happened in my life in all of those years in between, and then decided what to include to show when Jake was really happy, when I was really happy, and then eventually show when things started not to go right, when things started to happen to him that started to wake up the voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, yeah, I mean, everything that happens just to Jake really happened to me, but lots of things that happened to my family, I decided not to include.
Yeah, no, and I can appreciate that. And it's also, I mean, very personal, right? And I imagine that if you're developing a character, you really want to develop the character with their intense emotions and really, really get into their mind. And so maybe that also worked towards that, right? In developing the character.
Yeah. And it's painful to spend 2 years in your childhood mind, and you realize so many things you never worked through, and memories that you had forgotten that writing this brought to the surface. And writing this was so therapeutic and so healing. And my editor, Susan Van Meter, recently said, in order for John Schu to write this book, he had to turn his heart inside out. Yeah. And that's the best way to describe what I had to do. And sometimes I felt like I had to take it out of my chest and examine it, and then put it back in, I think, healed in so many ways. Writing this, I didn't realize how healing it would be to tell this story, but how super healing it would be to talk about the story and to have kids, 6th, 7th, 8th graders, 9th graders come up after and talk to me about their own stories and to open up their hearts to me has been healing. And I was afraid it would be too much, that it would my mental health would struggle. But thankfully, I did lots of, work to prepare for this book to come out, to be emotionally ready, and strategies to not take all of their stories with me, and then lie in bed every night and perseverate about everything that kids shared with me throughout the day. Right. So it's been an extra level of healing talking about it.
Yeah. So I think that what you're saying is really important to think about, is that it's not only processing it through the act of thinking about it, developing a character, writing it, but then also the process of healing that comes with sharing the story. Because I do think, again, in narrative medicine, it is about not only being able to tell the story and share it, but it's also being witnessed, right? It's having somebody else.
That's what Sayantani says. Yeah.
Right. Having someone there to witness it, because it's one to just speak into a void, right? But when you feel that there are other people witnessing your story, holding space for it, it is incredibly powerful. And I think that's what you're speaking to right now.
Yeah, because when you look out, you can see how people are shifting and people are changing. And I'm very, very sensitive to energy in the room. And I feel like I work really hard to get the energy to be the way I want it to flow. And I can see people sometimes come in kind of closed-hearted looking. And as you're speaking and as you're being honest, they're opening up, and we're laughing and we're crying together, and people are feeling safe. Right. And I think when you feel safe, when you feel warm, safe, and loved, you're more willing to open up. Yeah, and to share.
Absolutely. It's that, Brene Brown's work of, when you as a person are open to being vulnerable and honest and truthful, you actually create an environment for others that are there present to do the same. And I think that that's what you're talking about, but I think that's what's so powerful about your book. I really do. I think that is what's so powerful, because you have created a character that is so real and so honest that it allows the people who are reading it, whether they're an adult like myself or a young adult like Zane, my son, or a 6th grader, reading it, they have the opportunity to say, oh, wow, I can also share my feelings, my story, whether or not it's exactly the same, but I'm being given permission to share what's going on inside of me, which I think is super healing and it's so important.
Yeah. Yeah. I love when people talk to me about the book. We don't often talk about anorexia. When people talk to me about the book, anorexia usually does not come up unless the person has struggled with anorexia in their lives. And when the book first came out, I was afraid like I'd only hear from people who had struggled with that. But everyone who talks to me says, I saw myself in this because I too have a voice in my head that often tells me I'm not good enough, and a voice that tells me that I don't deserve X, Y, and Z. And people with OCD and with anxiety, which is so many people, see themselves in this story. And so I'm really grateful for that. And also that it just hasn't been labeled a book about anorexia nervosa.
Yeah, which I think is so important. I was going to ask you about, I do want to talk about the eating disorders just from your experience because, this is a health and wellness podcast. So I would like to jump into that. But I think what you're saying is so important because I did do a lot of reading of all the articles that have been written about the book. I do all my research before I do an interview. And I know that some of the things that were written were that that there was a concern that this book would sort of be highlighting or encouraging kids in some way to, be in eating disorder land in their heads or whatever it is. And I think what you're speaking to is really important, that it's actually the opposite that you're finding.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful for that. I've talked about this in a lot of interviews that when I was in the 7th grade, I was pretty certain I had an eating disorder. And I remember going to the Tinley Park Public Library and finding an isolated library carrel and looking up terms like anorexia and bulimia and eating disorder and whatever terms that I would have thought of in the mid-90s. And it led me to things that were so harmful. It led me to articles about, Tracy Gold from The Growing Pains and Karen Carpenter and other things that I never name in interviews because I don't want people to find those and then use those to make themselves sick. And all the books that I read at that time were all how-to manuals, and they were toxic. And so to put out a book about a topic that you read books on that topic that were not helpful to your heart, it created a lot of anxiety in me. And again, writing The Gift of Story, I think really helped me not do that. Because in this book, I'm going to quote myself, which is always weird. I write that books can be the perfect prescriptions to let us know that we're going to be okay. And that was always in front of me when I was working on this book. And if ever the character was going to add something that I knew would be good for the reader, it didn't belong in there. And during the auction for this book, I was lucky enough to meet with 7 editors. And some of them were encouraging me to add things that were creating how-to manuals. And I knew that wasn't the right person to work on the book.
Amazing. And so that quote is beautiful, right? And so that's got to be such a fine line. I can't even imagine how hard that was to create a character who is going through an eating disorder and at the same time not cross the line. Like, how did you do that, John?
Yeah, no, I always saw myself. I always saw my younger self in that library carol. It was so, I could see it all the time. And anything like that I would have put in the book that would have then led them to a book that taught them a negative behavior, I just didn't need to be in there. Like, I feel like I'm protecting the reader as I'm writing it. I really am. I'm really aware of the reader. And I acknowledge that in the author's note, but I didn't fully realize how intentional I was until I started talking to kids and, adults about the book during presentations. And it was so amazing when I had my first experiences with kids who had read it. And I kept saying to them, you're the first person under 40 to read my book. Thank you. Like, I wrote it for them. I wrote it for adults, but I really wrote it for kids. I wrote it from my 13-year-old self that I wish this was the type of book I had found at the Tinley Park Library. I think it would have really helped.
And so how do you think that books are prescriptions for healing? I mean, we've kind of talked about this, but to quote you, back to you, how is that true?
Well, I think when you see yourself, as the main character, or for the first time you see yourself authentically reflected on the page. I think it tells you I'm okay.
Yeah.
I can get through this. There's other people like me. For me, it was Rent the Musical, which came out in the 90s at just the right time for me. And I actually changed the timeline of the book in order for Jake to experience Rent earlier than I did. I was born in 1981. If anybody were to create a calendar, they would see Jake was born in 1983. And that was just, I needed him to discover Rent a little earlier than I did. And that music was so healing for me. And then Alanis Morissette and Ani DeFranco and Tori Amos and all the Lilith Fair people of my high school years. So yeah. Where I remember I would copy those lyrics and I would tape them on my wall. And, lyrics are poetry and that poetry spoke to me and helped me, I think, really start to get on the path of healing.
Yeah, it's so funny when I came to your book launch in Andersonville, a few weeks ago, and you were talking about all these songs. I was laughing because those are, I'm 10 years older than you, but those are all the artists that I used to follow, but I was, a little older than you. I was in high school, probably college, but I was like laughing. I was like, oh my gosh. And these kids around me that were there had no clue who you were talking about, but I knew who you were talking about.
But actually 2 weeks ago, I was at the North Texas Teen Book Festival in Dallas, and I talked to Alanis Morissette, and these 4 11th grade girls stood up and they started clapping. I was like, do you know Alanis? And they were like, yes. They're like, my mom loves Alanis Morissette.
I know. As Zane was sitting with me, he knew all of those artists because he's heard me listen to them, but it was really funny. I want to go back to something that you said about, about copying down the lyrics and, of all these songs and, pasting them on your wall and that they're poetry, because you actually wrote this book in verse. Now, I will tell you, when I first saw that, when I got your book that launch day, at your book event, and I opened it up and I was like, oh my God, it's all poetry. And I'm sitting there talking to Zane and Zane's like, and I'm like, people write books in like a kid's book, like a children's book. And he's like, yeah, Mom, it's really, really popular. It's very powerful. And I'm like, oh, and I didn't understand until I read it. But can you explain, why in poetry? Why in verse? Why did you do that?
Yeah, so I love novels in verse, and I know Jane loved novels in verse in elementary school and beyond. And I think it's because of the white space. And I think it kind of helps calm your brain, all of that white space in the margin. And I think for more difficult, raw topics, novels in verse work really, really well. And a lot of novels in verse are about topics that are somewhat challenging at times to talk about. And I just think that white space gives the reader space to breathe. And I also think it gives the writer space to breathe. And I love that often in a novel in verse, you could shake it up and you could move the poems around and the story would still make sense. That almost every poem has a beginning, middle, and end. It's a full story right there. Jake has a really hard time taking up space in the world, but he doesn't on the page. And sometimes he writes a 10-word poem. Sometimes he writes like a 14-page poem. Sometimes the words overtake the entire page and it's just one word that goes across it. And I think also as a novel in verse, I was able better to show Jake's anxiety of how he's moving around the page and you're feeling it and you're feeling kind of anxious, I think, as you're turning the page. And I think, I think that it allowed me space to breathe. And all of my books, except for The Gift of Story, are poetry. This is a school is a 6-stanza poem. This is a story is a 5-stanza poem. But when you look at it, it no longer looks like a poem because of how the illustrator has broken it up. And I guess I'm now a poet. I was still a kid. That sounds so weird to say. And I recently said that to the poet laureate of England. And then I realized I maybe offended the poet laureate by saying I thought calling yourself a poet was kind of pretentious. He was like, what?
That's so funny.
I was like, oh, no, that's not what I mean.
No, I think there's something really powerful in what you said about creating space. I was actually having a conversation with a really good friend, mentor of mine, a fellow physician, Dr. Thamit Sethi, and we were talking about creating space to help us regulate our nervous system. And I'm thinking about that because you're right. There is something about reading poetry. It doesn't matter if it's, poetry for children or adults or, your book in verse. There is this breathing room that you have to help regulate your breath, but regulate your nervous system as you're reading something that is difficult, that's emotional, that is intense, right? And perhaps that is sort of some of the magic of your book and how it's touching people because it's giving some space to reflect, to think, to breathe, right? I'm sure that was your intention.
I love that. Oh, yeah, it was. And when I listen back to this podcast, I'm writing that down, quoting you and adding it to my presentation. That was beautiful. Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Because,
regulating it.
Yeah, because we live in this world that is so fast. And, going back to sort of eating disorders, I have some personal experience with eating disorders in teenagers. And, I think that there is this piece of slowing things down because again, it is something that's going on in the mind and it can be so rapid, right? The self-talk, the negative talk, the thoughts, right? And so trying to slow it down is really helpful for a person going through an eating disorder, but then also, a kid reading this book who might be identifying with it, right?
Yeah. And I think that's why the slow and steady, steady and slow, that's the way we always go. Even though it was such a big part of my childhood before I had an eating disorder, naturally fit in this book. That refrain of slow down, breathe, in and out. I mean, I still have to do that a lot as an adult. I mean, I use so many of the strategies that I learned from being hospitalized for 2 years for an eating disorder as an adult. And I didn't realize that I learned those strategies. But when I was hospitalized until I wrote, this book and went back to spending time in that facility in my mind,
right.
And that I'm the person I am today. Like it's one of the biggest gifts that have come from writing Louder Than Hunger is that people better understand who I am like as an adult and why I do the work that I do and why was always I would say a good third grade teacher, fourth grade teacher, librarian, because of all the trauma that I went through as a child, that I often bond with kids that not everybody does because I see in them pieces of myself from when I was a child. And a kid asked me the other day if I was a psychic. And I said, I'm not a psychic, but I'm an observer and I'm a critical listener. And I can sometimes see into people's hearts and souls, not literally, but it does feel that way. And this was an 8-year-old I was saying this to, and he got it. He understood it. And I said to him, but feeling all of this all of the time is hard and it can be overwhelming. And I said, if you're asking me this question because you also are a big feeler like I am, please write down your feelings and process them and talk to them to people because it can be really overwhelming if you keep it all to yourself. And I wish I had done that more when I was younger. But, as an adult, something that I often thought was a curse is actually a gift of being that. I feel an empath, I guess. I feel other people's feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have to take a breath because I'm nearly in tears because I know that that's what you did for my kid, for Zane. You saw him.
Yeah.
You really saw him in a way that no other teacher has since or did when he was that young. So thank you. It is a gift.
Well, thank you. No, and I'm crying because I was, as I was saying that I was connecting those pieces, but that's always who I am. With all and So thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Because again, it goes back to that idea of story being something that you can connect with other people by sharing a story, by reading a story, by, just being there to witness someone else's story. And I'm sure that's what you do. You've been doing with kids ever since you were teaching them in 3rd and 4th grade out at that school, in the west suburbs of Chicago, where my kids got to be with you, is that you were allowing them a space where they could share little bits of their story with you and with the other kids in the room. You were creating that environment, which I think is so important.
That was a big part. We're getting to know each other and connecting with each other and creating that safe space. Because I was always creating the space I wish I had when I was a kid. In every space I go to with children. And Louder Than Hunger allows me to talk about that now
Yes,
because it's all
absolutely.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's out in the open, so I want to tap back to, eating disorders, which are, so misrepresented in the sense of they're more frequently associated with women and girls, right?
Yeah.
And, this is challenging those stereotypes, right? That
Mm.
it's a young boy, a teen boy, men, how do you think your book, and you're sharing this in Louder Than Hunger, that is now a New York Times bestseller and on everybody's, sort of
Yeah.
view, is out there. How do you think it's going to help address the stigma around eating disorders in boys and teens and young teen
Yeah.
boys?
Yeah, I'm already seeing that it's helping with the emails. I mean, I'm getting from my other books, I maybe, get an email every other week about this is a schooler, this is a story. And I'm getting 5 to 10 emails a day from pediatricians, from
Wow.
counselors, but from the mothers of
Wow.
boys who are currently struggling or have struggled in the past. And a common theme is they ignored it for a really long time because they thought it was only something that girls got. They didn't think
Right.
that, and they even didn't take it as seriously when their own sons were hospitalized, or
Mm-hmm.
mothers and fathers who come up crying during book signing saying, I now know my son really is struggling and I've been trying to sweep it under the rug because of gender stereotypes.
Right.
And so I do think in kids reading this book, and is it a signed reading, hopefully not always a signed reading, but discovering it through book talks and through studies, that they will say, well, no, this is not, non-binary people or transgender people or whomever, everyone can develop an eating disorder.
Right.
And I think there's a stigma with it. And in the 90s, when I was on the Oprah Winfrey show, the theme of it was males with eating disorders. And I recently watched the episode, and the language that Oprah used to talk about males with eating disorders was like so offensive and
Mm-hmm.
just further, perpetuated the stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope this book allows us to see anyone can develop an eating disorder.
Yeah. And so what do you hope that these readers, I mean, you said that you've already found that, parents and educators and pediatricians are emailing you and saying thank you for, bringing this to sort of center stage in this way. What do you hope readers, especially those who see themselves in Jake, take away
Yeah.
from your book, Louder Than Hunger?
Yeah. The less serious answer, but I do mean it, is that they discover Alanis Morissette. That they discover like the music of the 90s, and they never knew of Rent, and now they're listening to Rent, and they're listening to Into the Woods, and they want to go see a Broadway show.
Yeah.
And they discover Family Matter and Step by Step and all of those 90 things.
Yeah.
And I know kids are discovering those
Yeah.
because of this book. But on a more serious note, I hope they feel less alone. I hope that they ask for help, that they find somebody who they feel safe to talk to, that they reach out to a school counselor, that they see that there's a way through and there's a way to the other side. And it's hard, and there's lots of trials and tribulations along the way, but life is easier and better and more fun when we're on the other side. And when we put strategies into place that help the big V voice in Louder Than Hunger, the voice is really a proper noun for most of the book. And there is a shift where Jake starts using a little V. And when Jake starts doing that, I hope readers see like he's doing better. He's talking back to the voice. He's listening to Dr. Parker and to Ruth and to Nurse Bruce, that he wants to do the work now to get better. And for me, for a very, very long time, I never wanted to do the work because I didn't think I could ever say, goodbye to the voice, that I didn't realize for a long time that I was actually the voice, and that it wasn't a separate person.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an aha moment that I think allowed me to start, doing the work and wanting to do well and not wanting to live the rest of my life hospitalized. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I answered that, but I was speaking through my heart.
No,
Yeah.
you did. You did. And so what would you say was the biggest, maybe aha healing moment? I don't know, realization that you had by writing this book?
Yeah, one of the biggest aha moments I had was what an influence Lincoln Park and Lakeview had on me during a day pass I used to go on day passes with my mom or my dad or my aunts or my grandma, where I'd have to go out into the world and, go to a movie and go to a restaurant or a musical. And they would often just fail miserably. Often I wouldn't even leave the hospital. I'd get to the lobby and say, no, I'm not going. But this one day I got to go to a mall called the Century Mall, which it only has like a movie theater now.
Yeah.
But at the time, we went to County Seat, I think it was called, which was like a clothing store. And I bought a new pair of overalls there. And then my mom and I went to a bookshop called Honor Bridge Books. And then we went to Melrose Diner, which was on the corner. It's no longer there.
Yep.
And then we walked by all the brownstones on Lincoln Park West, I think. And I remember thinking, I want to live here one day. I really want this. And I ended up moving there. When I was a third grade teacher, I lived right there.
Yeah.
And I had forgotten that's why it was that moment. And it was in that moment that there was a shift. So yeah, that was really healing. My goal was to live in Lincoln Park one day. I never thought I would, but I did.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so what would you say is the most healing part of writing the book for you?
Yeah, most healing part was doing the activities in the book. A lot of the activities that Jake does, like draw your heart and create collages and make I am poems, were things that I was encouraged to do when I was in treatment. I would either refuse to do them or I would lie when I was doing it. I was like an unreliable narrator of my own life. And Jake is not an unreliable narrator, I don't think. I hope he never shows up on one of those lists. But I was able to go back and actually do a lot of the work I wish I had done. And that helped me as an adult.
Yeah. So you became a reliable narrator.
Reliable narrator.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. And a really influential one, because your work, this book is already helping so many people, but it's going to help a lot more people. And so do you have time for us to just do a few speed round questions? I mean, they're fun questions.
Oh, yeah, I love speed round.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah. I'll try to keep it speed round, though. I tend to go on long tangents.
That's okay. That's okay. I don't mind. Okay, so complete this sentence. Books are...
Oh, books are windows to the world. I think somebody has said that before, but
amazing.
I'm either making that up or quoting someone.
That's okay. What is one myth about eating disorders that we need to change?
That you can never get better. I think a lot of people think, I meet so many people, in their 50s, 60s who've been struggling for most of their lives and tell me, no, I'm never going to get better. I think there is a path through.
Yes.
Yeah.
What is something that people often get wrong about you?
Get wrong about me? Well, I think something for a long time, people thought I was just always this most incredibly joyful person. And I've just been rainbows and unicorns and narwhals my whole life. And that's not true. And Louder Than Hunger has allowed me to show those sides. Yeah. Because a lot of people struggle. There was a child recently that just could not accept that I went through all of this. He said, but you're such a happy person.
Right.
And I said, but there was a lot of pain in my past. So all the sides of me.
Yeah. What is one thing that you're really excited about right now?
Oh, I'm really excited to go to New York City in a week to see all the shows nominated for Best Musical.
Amazing. How many are you seeing?
Yes. Well, it's the first year where I hadn't already seen them all. So I have 4 I need to see.
Wow, that's cool. That's amazing. What is a book that's on your nightstand right now?
Oh,
it's probably more than one. Knowing you, John, it's probably more than one.
There's a lot. So right now, we're going to say a book called The First State of Being by Erin Entrada Kelly. I'm rereading it right now. I've already read it, but I'm rereading it.
Okay.
First State of Being.
Okay, amazing. We'll make sure we link it in the show notes.
Yeah.
What is a song that you are listening to on repeat right now?
Oh, so I make a playlist every day. And the first song is every day. Yeah, every day. The first song has been the same for a year. It's No Day But Today. And it's a version that Adina Menzel created based on Another Day from Rent. It's a little different, though, because it's just one person singing it. So No Day But Today. And No Day But Today is like the anthem of my life.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love it.
Every morning. Yeah. That's what I have a rental car for school visits, and I usually listen to it at least 3 times in the car on the way to the school. It's a good
It's
way
like,
to start the day. No day but today.
yeah, revs you up and gets you ready for the kids,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this feels like a good place for us to end our conversation. And so I just have one last question that I always ask every guest. If I offer up the phrase to catalyze healing, what comes up for you?
Mm. Oh, crying and being honest. And as H.C. Camilla would say, opening up the suitcase of your heart. Because I think when we open up the suitcase of our hearts, we're better in a position to heal. Yeah.
Yeah. John, thank you so
Yeah.
much for this
Oh, that was deep. That
time,
was
this
very deep.
conversation. Yes, it's been amazing talking to you. And I know I've thanked you many times, but thank you for what you've done for
No, thank
all
you.
these
Thank you.
kids and
No,
for
thank
me
you.
and for my husband, for my family and for my kids. Thank you.
No, thank you. This was such an honor and such a treat. Thank you. Thank you for laughing and crying with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks again for listening to The Healing Catalyst. If you love what you heard, please hit follow and pass it along to a friend. And if you're feeling really inspired, please rate and review so that others can find this podcast more easily. To learn more, head to AvantiKumarSingh.com. And to connect with me directly, find me on Instagram at AvantiKumarSingh. I'll be back next week and hope that you will be too. Until then, remember, with the right catalyst, you have the power to activate your own healing, because healing starts within.